And we should be able to work together in that direction. As Adesina has said, what is it that we need to do to unlock that potential? Talking about women, you know, one of the biggest campaign issues in Kenya in the last election was a lady called Mama Mboga. It was quite, you know, a discussion and what's happening to her. And I want to say proudly that today, because of Mama Mboga, we're building 500 new markets, fresh produce markets across Kenya, to make sure that that Mama Mboga has a decent place to conduct their business that has dignity, that has space, electricity, water, and as I said, most importantly, dignity. That same Mama Mboga has access to credit. And through the county aggregation industrial parks, she will also be able to progress her business into value addition, into manufacturing in that space, all the way to export. This is the kind of deliberate, and let me repeat this, creating jobs, creating enterprise, creating opportunities is not a by-the-way issue. We must be intentional, we must be deliberate, and we must have real, tangible programs that create those opportunities. That's why when I speak to the people of Kenya, I tell them, if we are going to create jobs, it's not just growing the economy, because you can grow the economy without creating jobs. It's possible. You know, you have 5%, 7% growth, and you talk about it and people are asking, so where is this economy growing? Because they can't feel it. And that is why we're saying creating jobs must be intentional. That's why we have housing. That's why we are working on our digital job space. That's why we are working on export of labor. That's why we are working in all those spaces, because we need to be deliberate, intentional about creating those opportunities. We must create opportunities for growing income. They must be deliberate. So again, as you say, your ambition is in the right place. We will unlock that ambition using deliberate, intentional programs that will unlock that potential.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I now want us to go to Namibia, Uganda, and Mauritius as well. And I want to request Mariah to take the stage. Maria from Namibia.
Question is to the President, do you have any thoughts on the new negotiation agenda item on just transition programs and how Africa should position itself in these conversations? Thank you.
We'll also take the Uganda and Mauritius question together, and Your Excellency, you will respond all the same. Rose, Uganda.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, for joining us. My name is Rose Constantino, with Immigration Development Advocate. When the FD President was talking about migrants, and I'm coming in with the question there. First of all, I'd like to share that over 10 million people have already been displaced of sub-Saharan Africa due to climate-related events. And with no action, 86 million will be displaced by 2050. And we know that, I'm not going to explain this, we know what is happening in Somalia with the delayed rain seasons, with 5 consecutive seasons, and we know the recent floods in Rwanda, over 35 people died. continental free trade area, but also the fruit network partners protocol. Thank you.
We have that question from Mauritius, and then Your Excellency will respond.
Can she repeat that again? We didn't get Mauritius.
So my question was, seeing the economic importance, especially for small island development states such as Mauritius, how can Africa and Africans promote, leverage, and ensure sustainable tourism strategies, knowing that us, small island developing states, have faced very unique challenges and vulnerabilities when it comes to climate change? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Starting with Maria and just transition from Botswana, is it? Yes. So the conversation around just transition is a present conversation. It is a conversation that's a must-have, because the balance that the conversation tries to address is it feasible? Is it reasonable? Is it bankable for us for the transition to happen from fossil fuel to green energy? And let me give you a practical example from Kenya. It is possible to run our grid using green energy, renewable energy. 93% of Kenya's grid is green or renewable. So are we funding it? Can we support our development? Yes. So, but we need a candid conversation as to what happens to countries that have huge resources of fossil fuel energy, and how do we transition those that are exploiting those resources at the moment into the green space. One of the aspects that we must address is the aspect of financing and technology. Those two will unlock the potential we have in green energy if we have technologies, and we're very happy a lot of movement has gone in developing technologies that would help us unlock the renewable energy potentials, but also financing. And that is why we are having a very big conversation about financing. So those two will make it easier for us to have that conversation about just transition. On the aspect of migration, Kenya has already signed into the Kampala Declaration. I did speak to President Museveni this morning about it, because it's going to be part of the conversation we are going to have in the summit. This summit will provide an opportunity for countries that haven't signed into the Kampala Declaration. That makes it much more easier for victims of floods, droughts, victims of climate change to find safe haven. We must, as humanity, realize that climate change is not, for example, our making as Africa. It is not the making of ordinary citizens. We're here together. And we must make it much more easy for people to find safe haven when they are victims of climate change, whether it's drought, whether it is cyclones, whether it is what you're talking about, the flood, the mudslides in Rwanda, the big challenge we had in Mozambique, in the western part of Kenya, or for that matter, the drought in Kenya, and Somalia, and Ethiopia, where we lost close to 9.5 million heads of livestock in the Horn of Africa. We must make it much more easy for us to attend to those who have to move away from situations that endanger life and endanger their existence. And I hope that we will be able to persuade more countries to sign on so that we can provide an easier ecosystem of working together, collaborating, and making sure that we provide avenues for people to migrate when that is necessary, but in a manner that is responsible. And finally, the smaller states, the island states, who have the largest risk because of climate change. For example, the Caribbean, Mauritius, Madagascar, Comoros. These are islands that, if we do not deal with the challenge of climate change, could easily be submerged. And therefore, we must, as humanity, realize the danger these islands face and work with them to make sure that we address the challenges of climate change. And that is why, for example, we are having this inaugural conference in Nairobi. This is the first time as Africa we are coming together to discuss our ideas, our suggestions, bring our assets on the table, and provide solutions on this very challenge that is threatening humanity. And the island states, the people suffering drought, the people suffering cyclones, those who are at risk in the Sahel and many of the other areas will be part of the conversation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just on Maria's point, on the just energy transition. Energy transition doesn't have to be just. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to make sure that it is something that allows us to develop, not with what we don't have, but we have to develop with what we have. So let me take it's a renewable energy that we've been talking about. Yes, we have that potential. Nobody eats potential. We have to unlock that potential. And for us at the African Development Bank, today, we devote 87% of all of our financing on energy generation to renewable energy. So one of our biggest programs we have is Desert to Power, which is a $20 billion investment we are making all across 11 countries with the Sahelian zone, which includes, Mr. President, also northern part of Kenya. And I'm just coming also from Eritrea, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, all those areas, and the rest of the Sahelian countries. $20 billion investment that will allow us to construct 10,000 megawatts of solar and allow us to provide electricity for 250 million people. And when it is finished, it will be the largest solar zone in the world. And so we are trying to make sure we can harness the power of the sun for our development. So we are doing our best on that. We are doing our best in the issue of hydro. We're working, of course, we have to do the big project in Inga, which we have to actually do that. We are working with you here on geothermal, with the Menengai and all the others that you have. So all I'm trying to say is that we are maximizing on everything we have. But there must be realism. We cannot power African economies only on renewable energy. Look, today, so we should move away from ideological stuff and be practical. Europe is buying gas all across Africa. Why? Because they have to stabilize their grid. In Africa, I'm looking at, even in Kenya, you had power cuts because of the variability of the power. Other countries have power cuts because renewable energy is highly variable. Now, we need it, but we need to have stable grids to run industries, the kind of industries, Mr. President, that you are talking about. So that means we don't have nuclear. The only thing we have is gas. And therefore, natural gas must be part of the energy mix of Africa to be able to, first and foremost, drive stability of our grid, It's faster to have gas to power, modular systems, and so on. And it's very, very important. And now, I know others, some people will say, oh, okay, President of African Development Bank, wait. Are you not going to be contributing to global emissions? The answer to that is a big no. The analysis that we have done at the African Development Bank, that the Global Center on Adaptation has done, and the International Energy Agency, Mr. President, we find that if Africa were to use today all of its natural gas to do just power, you know how much we will add to global emissions? 0.5%. That's it. And so we contributed only 3% since 1890 in terms of emissions globally. Give us room to develop. Give us space to be able to industrialize. We are doing the maximum we can with renewable energy, and we will continue to do it. Reality is, renewable alone will not power this continent. We have to have stable grid. That's very, very important, and it's not going to add to any global. It's not going to add to any global emissions. Now, when somebody goes on a cruise and they have a cruise ship, so you go from one room to the other, you play basketball, you play this and so on. The cruise ship, Mr. President, is stable. That is how energy transition is for developed countries. You can shift from one thing to the other, but your economy is stable. For us, because we still have 600 million people without access to electricity, we still have 900 million people, majority of those women, without access to cooking energy. I will compare our own to being like on a rickety boat. So if you move from one side to the other side, you're just going to flip over. So we must recognize that no one size fits all. Every country, every region should be allowed to use what it has, being mindful of its commitment to Paris Agreement. When people also talk about Paris Agreement, and young people, youth, I want to really explain this to you. Paris Agreement requires that 80% of the financing for the national development NDCs of our countries be financed by the global community, providing $100 billion a year in financing. That's not been done. 80% of it is conditional on that. And so if we are saying, let's do just energy transition, let's first meet the commitments that have been made. I remember my late mentor, Kofi Annan, told me something, Akin. He said, Akin, the only promises that matter are the promises that are kept. The world should meet its promise of that commitment of $100 billion. That would go a long way on that. Now, I want to also touch about the issue of migration that was raised, I think, from Uganda. Mr. President has already talked about that, but I just want to add 3 points to that. One of the reasons why we also have migration a lot in the Sahel, other places, is what I call a disaster. Mr. President, that disaster triangle is anywhere you find it, you will find terrorism, you will find instability. It's first and foremost extreme rural poverty. 2, you have structural unemployment among young people, which is what we're talking about today. And thirdly, environmental and climate degradation. Whether it's in the Horn of Africa, whether it's in the Sahel, almost anywhere you look at, if you have that disaster triangle, it's going to be there. So we must build resilient economies. We must create jobs for our youth. We must transform our rural areas to make sure that people aren't moving out of those places and going elsewhere. And then we must make sure that we have the financing to build more resilient Africa. The other thing I wanted just to bring to your attention here, everybody, is how we insure ourselves. And it comes back to the point of Mauritius. Africa needs to insure itself against catastrophic risk events. Droughts. I was talking to President Ruto. President Ruto told me that for the first time, the wildlife was affected by the droughts here for the first time ever. And so we have, we are doing water tracking for wildlife. And so what we have is something called the African Disaster Risk Insurance Facility, which we use to also support Kenya, where we pay premiums for countries to insure themselves against catastrophic risk events. And I think in this summit, Mr. President, with your leadership, we want to scale that up. It's worked for Niger, it's worked for Mali, it's worked for Madagascar, it's worked in, even for Kenya here, we did it. We need to scale up financing facility to ensure our economies against extreme weather events. For Mauritius, for example, the issue of catastrophic bonds is very important. We have to find, you mentioned earlier, Mr. President, the need for innovative approaches. And I think catastrophic bonds are important. But let me also say that Africa cannot support itself in climate finance just by relying on loans. A lot of these things have to be also by grants. Yeah? If you want to clap, you can clap. It's okay. You know, already we are shortchanged by climate change. Why are we going to be shortchanged again by paying more expensive loans to really develop our economies for what we did not create? So I want to make a case here that we need to therefore ramp up significantly concessional financing at scale for African countries to be able to ensure themselves, like in the case of Mauritius. So we are going to continue to work globally to make sure we can do that. I mentioned to you about the climate action window of the African Development Bank, but we want to do more. We want to do that from right now is $429 million. We want to go to $13 billion. Right? We want to raise $25 billion for African Adaptation Acceleration Program. But most of these resources, let me say, has to be concessional financing resources. We can't take more debt on top of climate-induced debt that we already have.
Thank you so much.
Just to add one aspect to what my brother has said in terms of just transition. It is very important that we are realistic about where countries are. It's also important for us to say two things. Even as we push all buttons to make sure that we have green growth and industrialization and manufacturing, we must also be cognizant of where we are at the moment in terms of development relative to where others are, and how they got where they got using the wrong sources of fuel. And should we repeat the mistake without the rest of the world keeping their promise is the only option left. So we must, the rest of the world must live up to the commitments, whether it is the SDRs, whether it is the loss and damage, whether it is what was committed in Paris. These are commitments that must be kept, number one. Number two, we must also invest in clean energy. Today, only 1% of resources invested in green energy is invested in Africa. So it needs to be scaled up, in our estimate, to 10% by 2028 and to 40% by 2050. It is the only way we are going to decarbonize global growth. So these are very important aspects as we discuss the carbon transition. And to agree with my brother that migration is fueled heavily by effects of climate change. They cause instability, they cause conflict, they cause poverty, making people move from where they are. We need greater resilience. We need to fund. We need to make sure that countries have the resources to stabilize, to fund resilience. And that is why financing becomes a very big component of the conversation. And when we talk about financing, we're not talking just about loans, as my brother has said. And especially if we are getting loans 5 times more expensively than others. And that's why the conversation around financing is very important. And that's why I'm very happy that this summit of young people is saying, let's have a conversation about a green bank, where new ideas, new concepts, new shareholders will have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. And I'm aware time is not on our end, and we have so many questions in the hall that we would wish to have you all day and possibly have an extra day of the assembly. But with your permission, Your Excellency, I'd like to combine your closing remarks with the Nigeria question, and we also have children in the room, so I'd like to also acknowledge Natalie and give her a few seconds as well to pose the question for the children that we combine with the closing remarks. Nigeria and Natalie.
All right. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Balkis from Nigeria, and I'm a farmer just like the president. I'm a pepper farmer, and I'm hoping that with collaborate, pepper goes a long way with chicken. I'm the co-founder of Grow Public Farms, and I currently serve on the Youth Advisory Panel at the Global Center on Adaptation. And my question is actually coming at the right time when we have been talking